Okay, so then we'll start with today's stuff. This lecture is going to be focusing mostly on kind of the minutia of collecting data. This will be largely familiar for the people who've been collecting data so far and largely not memorable for the people who have not done data collection yet. But this will at least be a really good resource for you for when you get your first hands-on training to go back and refer to. And hopefully there's some stuff in here like troubleshooting tips for people who have been doing data collection that might not know everything going on. This is everything that I know, but if other people also have like, hey, we did this and it worked, shout it out. This stuff is also going to be very NIRx specific, obviously, because that's the system we're working with. So if you were at some point to work with a different NIRS system, the principles might still be similar, but the exact way it's done is going to be very different. And then we'll talk about what goes on in fNIRS data pre-processing. We won't do the pre-processing today and all the data handling for that. We'll do that first thing tomorrow, mostly because I still don't have the code posted yet. But this will give you an idea of why we're making certain choices in our code. All right, there's our start of our operating pipeline. And again, this section should be thought of as a supplement to hands-on training, not a replacement for it. This could be something that you share with RAs when you're training them how to run data, but this shouldn't be the only thing that you have them do. Because it's really, really valuable to first to remember how to do things by getting in there, putting your hands on things and going through the process, and also to really just understand what the machine is like and how you need to treat the machine. Speaking of that machine, we use a NIRx Scout imaging system, and we've also just got a NIRS Sport too, but that's not set up yet, so I'm still working on getting that going, but it's the same principle as the NIRS Scout, just a reduced number of sources and detectors. This larger system we have has 32 sources, which are labeled red at the end of the wires. It'll have an S and then a number to tell you that this is a source and this is the particular source that it is. And then the detectors are the same, but they're labeled blue and with letter Ds. They are standard detector tips right now. We're going to be upgrading the ones we have shortly, but that doesn't really matter for you guys when you're collecting data. That's just something to know that if Matt ever puts you in charge of operating the machinery and looking after components and stuff, just know that the upgraded detector tips are going to have higher dynamic range and things like that. The wires are fiber optic, meaning they're delicate and expensive. Do not stretch them. Do not let the heads bang on the counters when you're unpacking things, and don't let them be hanging on the floor where they can get stepped on. I always tell the undergrad RAs when I'm training them, each one of these bundles is a year's tuition at UCLA. So unless you're ready to pay for that, don't break things. The software we use for acquiring our data comes with the NIRx equipment and is called NIRStar. This must be run on a PC. What will maybe change drastically in the near future is they have a new acquisition software coming out along with their NIRS Sport 2. I have received a little bit of training on it. I haven't used it extensively yet. I just don't know nearly as much about it yet, so I'm going to talk about NIRStar to you and be familiar with it, knowing that this knowledge might become obsolete in a few months. First thing you're doing when you are setting up the procedure and the how-to for collecting data is to think about your interface between your participant and your machine, which is the cap. This is how we secure optodes to people's heads, keep them in place, make sure they're positioned over the right areas. These caps that we use are stretchy. They're kind of like swim caps so that they form fit to people's heads. They come in different sizes so that you can get a really good fit on people. They come in 54 centimeter, 56, 58, and 60 centimeter diameter. And then each of these caps have little slits, little holes cut into them that correspond to each position in the International 10-5 system, though normally we only use the 10-10 positions. This system, kind of like I mentioned at the end of last lecture, is a positioning system used by EEG imagers for a really long time. It uses external landmarks on the head for consistent placement of electrodes or optodes on participants. It's based largely on the idea that people's heads are not sized the same, but they're proportionate to each other. So even if you have a 60 centimeter head and someone else has a 54 centimeter head, the amount of distance between one landmark and the other is going to be half on your head between like the Nazian Indian and half on the other person's head between the Nazian Indian. And so you use that principle of, we know where some strong landmarks are. The Nazian is here in between your eyebrows. The Indian, if you feel the back of your head, there's this bump on your skull that you can feel before your skull kind of starts sloping down into your neck. That's called the Indian. That's another prominent landmark in your head. And then you have things that aren't as important to us, but that are also prominent landmarks called the parocular points. These are the little spot right in front of your ear. And you essentially use those to then say, okay, halfway between these and halfway between these is called CZ, the center of your head. Quarter of the way between those, FZ, and so on and so forth. And that's how we determine the same locations externally across people. External locations don't map super well to internal locations, and internal locations are very variable, kind of rehashing what Ryan's question was yesterday. But it's the best option we have for positioning fNIRS, and also, like I mentioned yesterday, there are methods for improving that positioning and then even matching it to internal stuff if you want to go the full 10 yards of getting like a MRI structural scan, putting a vitamin E caplet on someone's head while they're in the MRI, and then you know exactly where their external landmarks are relative to their internal landmarks. So when you're setting up a new study, you have to configure your cap. You have to decide where you want to put all these optodes. When you know how many source and detector optodes are available to you for each person's head that you're running, you plan their arrangement on this 10-10 layout called a probe montage. The sources in red here on the diagram and the detectors in green, they need to alternate so that there is always a source and a detector pair. They're kind of spaced evenly across the head. And we use the standard 3 centimeter space between each one. We have some standard layouts that are programmed already into NIRStar, such as prefrontal, motor. This one here that I'm showing is what we use for the summit study. This is a prefrontal plus bilateral TPJ. And then if you want to go and make your own, there's also a probe montage template I've uploaded to the drive in our Bootcamp folder. It has 32 channels and 32 detectors and 32 sources available, and so you can move the little dots around as you want, and the little purple bars are where your channels are. So you can kind of mix and match and experiment in making your own templates and probe montage if you so choose. Then on the physical cap, once you have your probe montage set up as a template, you need to make that template in the actual physical caps. You must, to build these, there's things called grommets, which hold the optodes in place into the cap. They are made of base and a top, and essentially they're kind of like a button that you push through each hole and then snap in place. And then there are little colored labels that you put on each one of these grommets to tell you this is where, say, detector 1 is supposed to be, this is where source 10 is supposed to be, and so on. We have two kinds of grommets we use. There's the standard grommet, which is on the left. We call it an Audi because it's sort of raised above the cap, and it holds an optode just by kind of pushing the optode into it, and then it's tight enough that friction will hold the optode in place. And then we also have the bases that are used for our spring-loaded caps. We call those the innies. And if you put an optode into that straight without any sort of cap, that it can fall right out. It's built to work with what's in the lower picture, which is a spring-loaded cap. These little plastic caps have springs on the inside, and they kind of snap into the innie base. And those springs help push optodes through the cap and through hair and making sure it's getting right to the scalp. We usually use the Audis on forehead because they're faster to set up, and then we use the innies on anywhere that there's hair on a participant's head. And again, blue labels mean detectors, red labels mean sources. And when you're building a cap, we have extra grommets and labels in the white drawers that are in the fNIRS study room. You also need to tell the acquisition software when you're planning a new study what your montage is that you're going to be. You can either select those pre-programmed montages, or you can create your own, which is building a set of files that tells the acquisition software essentially where to expect various sources and detectors to be located. I'm not going to go into exactly how to do that because we have a user manual that explains all of that. We'll put a PDF copy in the drive, and then there's a kind of flipbook manual in the room. But the steps are essentially going into an analysis software called NIRs Lab. You run the setup probes function, and it creates what's called a probe info file, which we use later for our analyses, and that's telling analysis what your channel arrangement looks like. And then in NIRS Star, you create what's called a topo layout file under the Configure Hardware tab. And this is telling the software spatially, this is where everything is organized, so that when it's displaying the acquisition to you during real time while you're collecting data, the channels that are like visually represented on the top, are the ones that are on people's forehead versus on the bottom, those are on the back of the head. And you can also make a hyperscanning topo layout, which is that but doubles if you have two people going at the same time. And then optionally, you can create just a PNG picture of the montage layout if you want that. And then in NIRS Star, you create a new montage by selecting all of those files, entering the number of sources and detectors that you're using, and then it creates what's called a configuration, and that's the montage that you then select every time you open up NIRS Star to run your study.
Shannon, can I just chime in here?
Yeah.
So just two things. One, NIRx also has this tool that they made called NIRS Site, which allows you to basically point and click where the optodes will go on the head, and then that software will create these files for you. So it's like a little bit user-friendly once you can figure out how to make it work, so you have to do less steps. And then the other thing is just as we have more studies going on, just to make sure we're coordinating about who's using which sets of caps. Especially when you have dyads, you need to have both of them set up in the proper way, and if you're using a different layout than somebody else, it can get a little bit complicated. So just make sure you're checking in with people on which layout they need to use and which sets of caps you're planning to use.
Right. If you're doing a hyperscanning study, you're going to need your montage set up in two sets of every size of the cap, because you might have the case where two people come in and they have the same head size. Speaking of cap setup, when you're running a study, the first thing you do when your participant comes in, you have to put all the wires into the cap. You have to set up the cap. You first measure the participant's head size in centimeters, and you do that around the head, passing through the nasine and Indian points. If they have a size that kind of falls in the middle of our cap sizes, you want to round up to the nearest even centimeter, and that'll be the size of cap that you use for your participant. You then attach the optodes to the correct position in this cap, either by pushing them into the outie grommets or by plugging them into the right space in the innies and then slotting a spring cap over the top of it. Things that help with participant friendliness and just keeping everything organized and not tangled, so ensure that wires, when it's all set up, are running back over the top and behind the cap so that there's nothing that's hanging in front of the participant's face. So while you're setting up the cap, know which seam is the front of the cap so that you can kind of position the optodes facing the correct way. And with really dense cap configurations, it can be helpful to set things up from the back to the front. So you have the back, and then the wires from the front are hanging over the back ones instead of things being all complicated. But when you're setting up these caps, it can be faster to do it with two people, and in that case, making it really neat can go out the window. Setting up one of these caps, especially if you don't have much experience in it yet, can take a few minutes to do. For like a full head cap. For reduced channels, it's much faster. So if you have a participant coming in, it's ideal to know their head size ahead of time. but most times that's not going to be the case. Like if your study doesn't have a pre-session where they come in for something, then you're not going to be able to measure that. And I wouldn't recommend relying on participants measuring their own heads because they don't really know how to do it. So in that case, just have them come to the lab. First thing they do before anything else is measure their head size so that you can start setting up the cap while they're doing things like reading the consent form, filling out a pre-survey, stuff like that.
I have a question about
Yeah.
rounding up. So if it was something like 10.2 centimeters, would that mean it's 12 centimeters?
So by rounding up, I mean like in the whole centimeter numbers. If you measure around someone's head and it's like 56 point, I don't know, 4 or something, just use the 56 cap because these caps are stretchy. But if it's 55, I would round up to 56 instead of using the 54.
Just a relevant question. Does it ever make sense to round down? So for example, if they have like really thick hair and that might be adding to what it is it better to use a smaller cap to get the optodes to actually touch their head, or in that case we can round up?
It could be. The only reason I would round up much more often than rounding down is I think rounding down would only work if their hair is big because it's poofy. Like if they just have really thick hair but it's not like squishy at all, not pillowy, and it's just on their head, then a tighter cap is still going to put a lot more pressure on their head. And there are reasons for participant comfort, for wanting them to be comfortable. The longer they sit through these studies, the more tight it starts feeling. And so you don't want them being unhappy. But also, if things are really, really tight on someone's head, that increases localized external blood flow, which contaminates your signal more. So usually I err on the side of making the participant more comfortable. And then there are other ways we can try to make things tighter. Like we have these zip-up overcaps that can help you with tightening the fit, things like that. When you have your cap set up and you're ready to put it on the participant's head, this isn't like the only way to do it. This is just what I find is the easiest way, because especially with a really dense cap and the wires are all everywhere, it can be difficult to get this thing stretched over someone's head and fit it in the correct position. So my favorite method is first make sure the participant takes off any hats they're wearing. If they have long hair, make sure it's let down. So if your participant has long hair and they're wearing it up in a bun or back in a ponytail, or even if it's in a thick braid, you might ask them, hey, can you let down your hair? Because it's much easier to work through hair that's been like more distributed over their head than stuff that's really bunched up in the back. Then when you're putting the cap on their head, kind of hold it open, and then usually, any study we run at least, there's an optode positioned in the front of the cap right along the front seam. If you're not using a configuration that has that prefrontal setup, you can still find the hole in the cap where that position would be. Center that over the third eye position on someone's head, kind of right between their eyebrows. And then while you hold that there, you can stretch the rest of the cap over their head. And then from there, it can help to get optodes threaded through the hair if you grab the Velcro straps that are on the caps, give them a wiggle, and then before everything, you Velcro it down and tighten it up. Make sure the cap is positioned correctly on someone's head. For getting correct and consistent positioning on people's heads, the bottom seam of the front of the cap must be sitting right above their eyebrows, and it must be centered on their head. It can't be tilted one way or the other. You can see that pretty easily if you look them straight in the face, because the cap kind of looks like this, and so if that's tilted at all, that'll be pretty noticeable. You can also make double sure is, I'm not sure where our China marker is, but it's essentially a very large crayon. And you can draw a little point on the participant's scalp. They won't notice it. It'll wash off next time they wash their hair. That is halfway between the ocular points and halfway between the nasal and inion. And then when you're putting the cap on, make sure there's like an empty grommet in the CZ center of the cap that is centered right over that little red point. We also have the system, meaning it's sitting in a box, and I haven't worked with it yet, but we have this system called a 3D position digitizer. It's a polymus system specifically that we have, and once you have the cap set up on someone's head, it essentially allows you to register where those major external landmarks are, and then you touch where all the optodes are positioned on the head. This registers each participant's opto position into what's called real space, and that would be akin to the kind of shared space morphing that you do to MRI scans to get everyone into a shared space so that you know this person's channel location was just like slightly right of this other person's channel location and so forth. This tells you much more information about how accurate you're being in placing your caps between scans, and when you do your analysis later you can even do things like I have this kind of area that my channels are falling into, so my signal location is going to be some sort of average of in between that area. Haven't worked on doing this yet because it's kind of involved to set up, so if anyone wants to do that, you are free to do it, but I'll get it working shortly. Some things about fitting the caps to the head. You want to stabilize the cables so that they don't shift around. Things you can do for that are pulling up slack. We have the cables propped up in these movable kind of jointed arms, and if you have a long tail of cable running between the participant and those arms, then there's a lot of weight and drag pulling on their cap. So you want to pull up the extra slack through the arm so that there's less weight of the cable hanging between the participant's head and the arm. You can also use what we call these candelabras, which are these little kind of forky plastic things. If you put them into empty grommets on the cap, then you can put the wires into them, and they hold those wires in place so they're not kind of flopping around the space of the cap. And especially if you pull a little bit of slack through those, then there's not going to be any sort of tugging on that specific wire that would move the optoid around on someone's head. And then we also have this Velcro system that has kind of two clips on one side and then there's Velcro between them. And if you Velcro all of the cords into there, and again pull up a little bit of slack in front of those, then anytime the participant moves their head, that's going to be kind of the rotation point for the wires instead of each individual optoid head. So if they're moving, stuff that's above the Velcro is going to be much more resistant to the participant's motion than below it. And the last thing I want to say is just make sure a participant is comfortable before you're starting. Ask them, are you okay with now? And if they're like, yeah, it's fine, double check, like, no, really, are you okay? Because stuff will start feeling much tighter the longer the study goes on, especially if you're wearing a full head cap, because all these wires can get heavy. And too much scalp pressure, again, changes the psychology of the situation if they're focusing on how much pain they're in. That's not what you want them to be doing. But also, too much scalp pressure increases the external blood pressure that's not cerebral, and then there's more signal contamination. When you have your participant all set up, you do what's called calibrating the signal, and this is just allowing the acquisition software to set the gain levels, like how intense the light needs to be in order to make a good quality signal detection for each source and detector pair, and it tells you if you need to fix any optoid placements. So first you open NIRS, make sure the correct montage is selected in the Configure Hardware tab, and then once the cap is on the participant's head, you hit the Calibrate Signal button on the right side of the screen there. It'll then perform a few tests. That screenshot is one of the tests it's running, and afterwards, whatever your topo layout file is, you'll see this picture, this colorful picture pop up on the left of the screen that shows you the data or the signal quality in each of your channels. Each of those large pixels is one channel. If you hit the Use Topo View and Show Label or Topo Labels checkboxes at the bottom of the screen, then it shows you the numbers on each of those channels as well, and that tells you first number is the source number, second number is the detector number. When you're looking at this colorful picture, green and yellow are good. That means a good quality signal is coming through. Red is kind of a danger zone. We can sometimes recover good data from that, sometimes we can't. And then white means there's really terrible connection between a source and detector. Most of the times when you do your first calibration, you're going to see some reds and whites, and so then you have to go and make adjustments on the participants' heads to improve the signal quality there. You can do this by, if it's a optode that's in one of the spring-loaded grommets, you would take the cap off, remove the optode, and then you can see the participant's head underneath. If you can't see scalp, you can take a little thin wooden stick, we have a bunch that are in there, and just kind of go into that hole and push the participant's hair out of the way. don't like dig into their head, but like it's not going to be a big deal for you to like really just scrape the hair out of the way. So you do that until you see scalp, and then you put the opto back in and clip the cap back in place. If you have bad signal on one of the optodes that are over the forehead where there's not the cap system in place, that's usually because they have bangs. Then you can either take the optode and kind of like wiggle it back and forth to really get it through the hair, or you can kind of try to carefully push the optode further into the grommet. Just that being said, you don't want to push really hard because that'll dig into their skin and it'll hurt. Other things that can help are affixing a shower cap over someone's whole head. That can cut out light pollution that's coming from the ambient light. Or we have these zippered caps that are tight as well, but they have zippers along kind of the major axes of the head so that you can put it over someone's head and zip it up to make it a more personalized fit on someone's head and hold the optos tighter. And I usually do that if the cap is feeling a little bit baggy on certain places in people's heads. Some people have like wider heads than others, and so it'll be baggy in the front and back. Some people will have skinnier heads, and so it might be baggy on the sides. So you can use the zippered cap for that. And then just rerun the calibration a few times until nothing really changes anymore. Like all the effort you're putting into is not really getting you any more gains. Usually you can get pretty good readings if you work hard enough with the calibrations. We, though, run, because we're at UCLA and we have a really large East Asian student population, we get a lot of participants with thick, dark hair. And so I think most of the subjects that I run will have like a couple channels that are red. And like I said before, we can sometimes recover good data from that. And other times, that just means we have to drop that channel in analysis. It's going to be a bad channel. That's not a huge problem because each channel kind of is analyzed independently, so it just means you have missing data in that spot for a subject. Some calibration troubleshooting. There's a button on the top right of the NIRS star window, and it's labeled Details. If you open that, there are various metrics you can look through that kind of tell you different things about your signal quality and why it might not be good. For instance, if you hit the gain tab, that gain is again the like the strength of the signal that the source is trying to put out. Our gains can range between 0 is off, but 1 and 8. That's how many gain levels our system has. And if channels are using a really high gain, that means they're working really, really hard to get enough signal to a detector. And if that still means the channel is bad, then there's probably some hair or something blocking the source or detector in that pair. So you would want to go fix that source detector position on the scalp. If the gain is pretty low, but in the level tab, the signal level is high, that means the detector is getting kind of oversaturated with too much signal. That would be either the channel is too short, probably. You're really not going to experience that very often unless you just set up your capping correctly, but it's something to be aware of. And then in the dark noise tab, if the dark noise is high, that means you're getting lots of ambient light seeping into your signal. If your overall signal quality is green, that's not a big deal. That means that you, like proportionally, it's not much compared to your signal reading. But if your signal quality is low and you have a lot of dark noise, you can do things like turning off the lights in the room, putting a shower cap over the participants' heads to block out the ambient light. Some other calibrating troubleshooting, sometimes you'll try to fix things in the participants' heads over and over and it's not getting any better and you see just lots of red or white over someone's head. So what can you do for that? Some things to check are make sure you have the correct montage selected first off, since the montage tells the system which pairs to be looking for. If it thinks, say, source 11 and detector 12 should be next to each other, it'll look for good signal between those, but those might be on opposite sides of the heads in your actual physical montage. So just make sure you have the correct montage selected in the software when you're running the study. You want to check if the participant's wearing anything that might be getting in the way of the optode. This is rare, but I've had a few cases where it looks like the participant's fine, but then like when you're parting hair, they're like, oh, they're wearing hair extensions. There's a lot of like hair wefts underneath, and you can't get things to go through those. And other things like really thick braids will get in the way of that. And then just make sure that the source and detector bundles are plug firmly into the NIRs chassis, like in that picture. The top one, the source bundle, is pulled out a little bit. The bottom one is the way it should look. The detector ones, I don't think will ever give you trouble because those are plug-in and then screwed down, kind of like the HDMI cable is. But the source ones are just a plug-in, plug-out, so every once in a while those can get like nudged a little bit. So if you have calibration issues, you can just double check that the sources are pushed in all the way. Some other calibrating, troubleshooting, if everything is just looking pretty good, and then the last step of the calibration, everything turns bad. That's probably because the participant just moved at the end of your calibration run. You want to have your participants try to stay still while calibrating, because this is when your system is like iteratively deciding the specific levels of the signal. And so if you move and the optodes moves on someone's head, that'll throw off that whole calibration process. So you can either just hit recalibrate again, ask them to settle down, or if there's, you can double check into the details window, and if the gains all look nice, then you can just trust that the signal noise is going to stabilize again once you get running, and you don't really have to do a whole new calibration session, because in a full head that can take a while. Now some tips for collecting good quality data. When you're collecting the data, it's a pretty simple process. On the right side of the NIRStar screen, you would just hit record. That brings up a little dialog box where you can enter optional information about your participant, your run, your study. You don't have to do that. That just gets put into the header file that's made when it saves the data. And then after your recording, you see this live data feed appearing in the data visualization tab. That tab will automatically open when you hit the record button. You see a readout of the time courses in all the channels going across the screen there in red and blue. Red and blue are for both oxy and deoxyhemoglobin. It's doing a really fast, really rough calculation of the concentrations. And then on the right side, it's got your spatial orientation of the channels. And it'll flash like red for more signal, blue for more signal. Both of those visualizations, the time course readout and the spatial readout, have sliders, so you can change the scaling of this if you want to look and see how things are doing. If some of your channels were bad, you can change the sliders, for instance, on the visualization and check like, okay, how bad were they actually? If that channel seems to have much more variation going between red and blue than the other stuff around it, when it's just kind of like yellow-green mostly, then that's doing pretty bad. But if it's looking more like it has smaller variation in line with the other channels, then you'll probably have a good chance of getting good data out of that. If the optodes are well stabilized, casual movements from the participant will be fine. So things like if they're kind of resituating in the chair or speaking, kind of moving around, should be okay. You don't want them like head banging. Really jerky movements will be more likely to cause optode motion, so don't run a study with like jump scares in it or something like that. And another point is to just make sure the machine is warmed up. If the machine is off, then it can take a while to warm up, and temperature changes in the machine can change how our signal is measured. So that's why earlier today when Grace was going over rules of engagement for the room, just kind of leave the machine on. If we're going to be leaving the machine for a really long time, say like we're all leaving over winter break or something and no one's imaging for a few weeks, you could, if you're the last one running, you could probably turn it off to save energy. But then if it is off, make sure you turn it on at least 15 minutes before you're ready to record data you care about. Now, a lot of times people want to do what's called a baseline scan. This would be a scan that's acquired before your kind of active stimuli, and it might be at the end too. And it's essentially a null condition for you to compare your active condition to. Say if you have subjects watching a video, you would run a baseline scan of them just kind of sitting quietly. This isn't necessarily required if you have other ways of generating an experimental null. For instance, you could be pairing, like kind of bootstrap a null distribution between people watching different videos, but baselines can be a quick and easy way to get your null distribution experimentally. So if you're choosing to do a baseline scan, kind of make it somewhat similar to your active condition, make it kind of similar length, similar amount of movement that the participant's going to be going through so that you can meaningfully compare it to your condition you care about later on. Now for presenting stimuli, you can use real-world stimuli or computer presentation. If you're using real world, it's recommended that you video record it so that you can align the start of the stimuli to the start of the NIRS recording. You'll have both on video so you know exactly when stuff going on in the real world happened relative to the scan and what time in the scan was going on. Or you can do things like inputting a manual trigger. On our system, if you just hit F1, it inserts a trigger into the data trace. So if you are running something where you have to leave the room and you don't have IRB permission to record video, you could do something like "and begin," and that's when the participant knows to start having their experience, and that's when you know in the data the experience started at this point. If you're using computer presentation, you have a few more options, but you'll need to trigger the NIRS acquisition software from whatever computer you're presenting from. We recommend presenting from a separate computer so that the NIRS acquisition software doesn't ever run out of memory, because that can slow down the acquisition and the picture speed, and you wouldn't know that when just looking at the data. Some triggering options there are is you can use what's called a parallel port. That's a special kind of physical connection between the two computers. You can use a wireless connection. The NIRS Star has the option of receiving triggers over wireless. There's optical or audio triggering. That's the system we've been using for a while, but that's currently broken right now. But if you're using the optical version of that, you would essentially have this box with a kind of another photodiode running out at the end. If you stick that onto the screen, it can detect changes in brightness of the screen. So when you're presenting data to a participant, if you have like a white flash happen or just a little like white square appear on a black background, that tells the photodiode that something happened here, and then that puts a trigger mark into the data acquisition. Likewise, if you want to use the audio triggering portion of that, it looks for large changes in audio like a beep happening or something like that. You can also manually trigger, like mentioned, or do the time alignment. Like we did this with our Minerva study where we made sure that the NIRS recorded started at the exact same time that we hit start on a kind of presentation, that we then had output specific timings and lengths of stimuli and stuff so that you can then go into your data later and say, I know exactly that a 20-second block followed by a 8-second rest followed by a 16-second block followed by a 7-second rest, and then you can just put that into your data later. In terms of reliability for timing, I think the optical or triggering or the parallel port triggering is going to be your most reliable if you care strongly about having very, very accurate timings. I think manual triggering and wireless connection is going to be the least reliable for getting the exact time. And then when you are finally done recording, your participant's done everything you care about, just hit end on the NIRS Star acquisition software and it'll automatically save the data. The data is saved to the NIRx data folder on that acquisition computer. It'll be saved into a folder that's just named with today's date. And then inside that folder, if you took multiple recordings, it'll name each recording in a folder titled date _ which number it is, so 001, 002, etc. You can then rename these folders and organize the data however you want from there, like pulling it into whatever other data storage system you have. I recommend using some sort of consistent naming convention for your own data so that you can distinguish it from other people's data, because everything is being named automatically with the same sort of date. And then you can also easily and automatically pre-process all your files later if they're named in a way that makes sense.